First of all, I apologize for messing up on the leading the Lord's Prayer, but that's one nice thing about being old. You're too old to get embarrassed. So the scripture for today is Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to them, "Friend, I am doing no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." This ends the reading.
When I think about labor and the value of our work, I found myself remembering a character I knew when I was 19 years old, named Steve, the self-proclaimed shaman of Central Square. Have I told the story of Steve before? Okay, well, if I have, no one remembers, so I'm going to tell the story of Steve again. Steve was someone I noticed at the time I was working as a cashier at Pearl Art and Craft in Central Square in Cambridge, which was a different place than what it was in the 1960s. I think Steve arrived in Central Square at the height of Central Square being the beacon that it was of the 1960s, and he was really holding down the fort for that counterculture long after it had been, long after the People's Republic of Cambridge had become the Empire of Genzyme. And so, but Steve nonetheless would sit all day in front of Pearl Art and Craft on the street. Steve had long, long dreadlocks that went down past his ankles and would drag on the ground. In the hot months of summer, Steve would sit all day in the lotus position, meditating, with his basket, receiving money, and kind of like Lucy in the Peanuts, had a sign that said, "I offer you wisdom in exchange for a donation." He was a kind of oracle and fixture in Central Square. And actually, his best friend was another very unique character who seems to experience and perceive reality in a different way than perhaps most of us do. The longer all you beautiful people get to know me, I think you might be saying the same thing about me some days. But his best friend was a character named the Reverend, and the Reverend was this gentleman who had a pink sequin ball gown, and this was his constant uniform, and rainbow bright roller skates and a crash helmet, and he would go around with a boombox playing Donna Summers at all time. And that was his job. He did that 9 to 5. The Reverend was going up and down the streets bringing disco to the people of Central Square every single day. And Steve would be in meditation. And Steve, I once talked about him because people in the neighborhood were concerned about Steve's well-being, of course, because the elements can get intense on the East Coast, whether it's the hot summer or the cold. And Steve would be out there in the cold. If it was cold, he had a giant Cookie Monster Snuggie and would be dispensing his wisdom through the, while channeling Cookie Monster, I suppose. But Steve would meditate. And one time I asked Steve where he went at night, and he said, I'm a sadhu. I'm a sage. I don't have anywhere to lay my head. You tell me where I lay my head. And he said, I would ask you, what's your job? And he would say, well, I work all day. I spend a lot of time looking for socks. And you realized that being unhoused was a full-time job and effort. It was work and effort to find out where the next meal was coming from for Steve. It was work and effort to find people or places to find dry clothes. But Steve also did give an offering to the world. The world didn't necessarily appreciate it. Steve would sit still all day, and one day I did decide to sort of put some money in Steve's basket to see what Steve had to say for me. And I put money in the basket, and he said, a Zen poem for you. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by. Opportunity is lost. Each one should strive to awaken. Don't squander your life. How old are you? He said. I said, 20. And he said, how do you know that you're not middle-aged right now? So I still remember those quotes. Those quotes have showed up in sermons. That is good wisdom that I learned from Steve. Steve worked. Steve had a job. Steve did deem himself the shaman of Central Square, but he kind of actually was. I got to listen to the sort of wisdom he said to people as they passed by. And you would see businessmen, it's Central Square, Cambridge, so you would see very wealthy businessmen on their way to something profitable. And they would, sometimes you would hear in passing, I would hear them say to Steve, get a job. But they didn't understand that Steve was working. And Steve knew what his job was. And so every now and then, a more humble businessman might stop and put some money in Steve's basket and see what Steve had to say. And, one time I just noticed Steve pick a dandelion off the sidewalk and would give it to the businessman. Another time he would just say something very simple like, man, you really need to slow down. So even though the world didn't think Steve had a job, and even the reality is that Steve was working all the time just to live. And we're all working all the time to live. And Steve knew what his job was. And we might We might be working all the time, but we might still not know what our job is. And Steve knew what his job was. And these are the themes that the parable of the laborers in the vineyard invites us to look at. Jesus uses the vineyard as a metaphor for the realm of God, which is a unitive consciousness, which is a collective movement. He used the language of the kingdom of God, which is an inversion of the language of empire and the world as we're used to experiencing with its top-down hierarchies, and a world that teaches us that the businessman on their way to something profitable is working, but the person working hard also to get to their next meal is somehow not working. We're all working. The vineyard, Jesus uses this vineyard as a metaphor for the realm of God, where all things are working together for a shared abundance of life. And indeed, if you look at a vineyard, you see how that's true. I get to look at your gardens. I got to spend time in one of your gardens this weekend, actually. And if you look at a vineyard, you see how the sun is working with the soil, and the worms are working with the soil, and the trees and the roots are all working with the soil, and the animals that come and eat things are actually working with the balance of all things growing, and the bees and trying to get their food for their family are actually making food for us and spreading seeds and pollen. And you see how in a vineyard everything is working together in a balance to nurture, sustain, and expand this abundance of life. That's the life of the vineyard. In the eyes of Jesus, the vineyard is our whole sacred Mother Earth and the garden of life of which we're all a part. We can be inspired by the lessons that the parable of the laborers in the vineyard invites us to see on Labor Day. Indeed, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard reminds us that the whole vineyard, this whole sacred earth, this web of creation is cradled and held together, nurtured, sustained in the love that is the life and living Spirit of God. And that means nothing belongs to any one person, really. Nothing can belong to any one person. Of course, the landowner in the story is God, but it all belongs to God, and we meet and see God when we realize we belong to each other. We even belong to a God who belongs to us, who puts themselves in the position of belonging to us. The balance of life and the shared abundance and shared belonging is in all of our hands collectively with God. The fruits of this earth, all of our shared labor in the eyes of God, is not only in the hands of the collective, but particularly in the hands of anybody not receiving or at risk of not receiving the shared abundance of life. We can imagine the poverty of spirit in the person who scorned Steve. The poverty of spirit that is probably so defining themselves by their productivity, defining themselves by how they are perceived by society based on what they do, not by who and what they are, which is a child of God as much as Steve. Their inability to see Steve as a child of God means they're having trouble seeing themselves as a child of God. And so we're here to teach each other. We're here to join each other in that collective understanding and find ourselves in that belonging and in that shared abundance. The parable invites us to ask the question, what is our true work? What is our true labor? What's our real job? Because in the eyes of God, what you do from 9 to 5 or where you make your money isn't necessarily what Jesus is talking about when he invites us to explore what our work is, what our job is. When Jesus invites us to see our job, we're hearing someone who says it's your job to shine your light. It's just your job to be who you are in the world and offer yourself and the fullness of yourself to the world as an offering, and that's enough. That is enough. The parable reminds us how at the end of the day, everyone gets paid the same. Everyone gets paid the same whether we leave this world as a billionaire or a beggar. And whether we live our lives unhoused or work every day from 9 to 5. And actually, I think Steve was working overtime if we really clock the hours. Human beings, the parable reminds us how at the end of the day, everyone gets paid. And I wanted to lift up a few different perspectives on the theme of what is our spiritual work, what is our spiritual job. Sun San is a Korean Buddhist monk, and he said, human beings' job is to help all beings. Human beings' job is to help all beings. How did we get this job? Humans have a consciousness where we can have compassion, where we have a compassionate mind. Compassion mind means only help other people. Not thinking about me, only helping other people. Choice means great vow. A great vow means all the beings in this world, all of our relations are numberless, and we vow to help all of them one moment at a time. That's choice. Sentient beings are numberless, we vow to help all of them. That is the human being's original job, which we do one moment at a time. And this is like what Jesus invites us to do in the parable, which essentially is to be builders of the realm of God, where the last is first, and the first is last. It's a completely insurmountable task. Like how the Buddhists are trying to save all beings and liberate all beings from suffering by showing up to every moment with compassion. It is like how we are invited to be builders of this realm of God, this state of abundant life and great compassion for all beings, which is eternal. That's a pretty towering task, but we're invited to do it moment by moment by moment. And we have all the tools we need to do that just by showing up to the moment with an open heart and open arms, with just ourselves. Howard Thurman says, don't ask. This is another perspective on spiritual work. Howard Thurman, the African-American mystic and theologian and civil rights activist, said, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and do it, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So some of us have employment where what we consider our passion and our gift aligns with how we're being financially compensated under the system in which we live, the economic system. Perhaps others struggle with these things feeling not so much in alignment. And we might have an idea of what we think our job and our purpose in the world is, or might be, but while we're focusing on what we think our purpose might be, getting that next certification, acquiring that next flashy thing for our resume, while we are trying to carve out that thing that in our minds we say, then I will be fulfilling my purpose. We might have fulfilled the divine purpose of our life yesterday by the way we offered kind words or held a hand or said something to a stranger that they will remember 20 years from now. I don't think Steve knew that their words were going to be echoing from a pulpit in Oregon 20 years later. Who knows how you're fulfilling your purpose? But it's already fulfilled when you bring love into every moment of your life. Khalil Gibran said of work, "Speak to us of work," the plowman asked, and he answered, saying, "You work that you may keep pace with the earth and the soul of the earth, the soul of the vineyard. For to be idle is to become a stranger unto the seasons and to step out of life's procession that marches in majesty and proud submission toward the infinite." During times of unemployment or underemployment, we find ourselves asking, what's my purpose? What's my true work? Many of us who are retiring for the first time are asking, okay, well, what's my purpose now? Before you had any job, your purpose was fulfilled before, during, and after your job from the perspective of this parable. The reminder of today's parable for those of us struggling with these things, these questions of purpose, and the good thing for all of us to remember every day is that before our day job, we are enough. I also like the subversive message of this paragraph is that really every day is Labor Day because our shared abundance literally belongs to labor. That's kind of a neat little twist that, Jesus gives to us. But the overall takeaway for all of us is that our stories, our insights, our experiences, the light of our being is enough. Our true work is simply showing up as our full selves with these open hearts, and that's enough. And I had to give context to that. Some of us had a meeting this weekend planning the Peace Table dinners. We're having another Peace Table dinner in November. I mentioned it during the prayers. These Peace Table dinners have been about a variety of different topics. We heard from an environmental activist. We heard from someone collecting seeds and saving seeds and doing work to replenish the soil. We heard the Gaza monologues, and that dinner was exploring peace and justice issues and anti-war themes. This next one is about community-supported health. So all the dinners have a different peace and justice theme, and the thought of the dinner is to offer a forum for us to look at issues affecting our world and affecting our community, and creating a space not only to feed each other good, healthy food, but also learn from each other. And that in itself, creating in a time of disinformation and fractured community, creating that space where we learn from each other's stories is itself a ministry. We realized as we were planning this dinner, also we had this attitude of the poor and suffering are out there. But actually, we realized we all had issues with the healthcare system. We realized that the stories we needed to hear were right there at that table. Right there at that table, we had the story of someone who in their life experience ran a community-supported health clinic. We realized the abundance present right there in the room, and all we had to do was show up for each other and create the space to hear each other's stories and create the context for us to learn from each other. And that's the kind of showing up that this parable invites us to do. That's a great invitation that we are capable of offering and space that we are capable of welcoming other people into as a faith community. The wisdom at the table was enough. We didn't need experts from outside. We didn't need to run to find the last and least far away from us. We had to show up for each other and with love and curiosity and to explore how we can have abundance of life with regard to community health in this case. There was a question, a very interesting question, is like, well, what is going to come out of it? Does this mean we have to start a community-supported health clinic? The answer to that, of course, was no. But in inviting the community, maybe we will create conversations that bring people together and serve as the baby steps that we take together toward a more organized community. It starts with us showing up for each other. It starts with us hearing each other's stories and being there for each other. In the eyes of God, this showing up is this, in the eyes of God, it is the system that creates poverty that is indeed impoverished. Impoverished in its lack of love and solidarity. Impoverished in its out-of-touchness with the truth of our interdependence. As we practice remembering that we are enough and receiving each other as enough, it's in the way we practice that we co-create and sustain the garden of life and find ourselves building a world where everyone is seen as enough and where there is enough for everyone. And so it's big work. And we do it together one moment at a time. And so thank you for showing up for each other this morning. You are most certainly enough. Amen.